So I wanted to start off by saying that I hope there's still some appetite for picking up some of the questions that were left hanging at the end of our wonderful discussion this morning. I'm actually not going to give the talk that I thought I was going to give. I've kind of massaged a little bit so as to respond to some of the issues that came up, which were along the same lines that I wanted to talk about anyway. I should also mention, sort of at the beginning as a caveat, that this might feel like something of a thump down from the heights that we've been sort of scaling so far. I sort of wanted to talk about, I've called my talk Discovering Our Models, and I want to think about how we go about developing these models by sort of telling a story of doing TEI customization and thinking about the ways in which the data model starts to come into view or to cohere as you work through this in a sort of practical sense. But I want to start with this quote from Wendell, from his article on the distinction between descriptive and procedural markup, where he says that an effective markup language will work by establishing a self-contained, internally consistent and clear set of categories perfectly sufficient for handling the data set to which it will be applied within the range of applications for which it is due. But this ideal is impossible for a truly descriptive language to achieve, and I think we've seen that quite strongly in our discussion so far, since the world is not a closed, finite set of phenomena that is liable to such treatment. Metaleptic markup, which is the sort of category he's proposing in this article as a sort of excellent place that we might aim at, gives us the next best thing. It invents its own imagined world, proposing earnestly or ironically that this serves both sides, both accounting for external reality as it is and creating it as it needs to be. And the idea there that when we're working with pre-existing materials, when we're trying to describe a set of documents that we might be working with, we're both interested in giving rich and provocative and interesting descriptions of those materials inside a system that we're also thinking of validating, that we're enforcing certain rules against so that we can do something with these descriptions that we've created to create sort of new data or future information, future ideas. And that, I think, is my perhaps poor paraphrase of Wendell's metaleptic markup idea. And so the question I want to ask is, how do we get there? And more specifically, how do we get there from here? This is a page of Frankenstein, a manuscript that both Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley worked on. It's part of a set of documents that we're currently working with at MIF, along with our partners at the Bodleian Libraries, the New York Public Library, Huntington Libraries, and the Harvard University Libraries, on a project called the Shelley Godwin Archive, which is bringing together as many of the extant manuscripts of the Shelley family, principally Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley, that we can get our hands on, and creating a digital archive of these materials, reuniting them from the physical archives where they currently live. And so for this project, we are creating a customization of the text encoding initiative suitable for describing these documents that we're working with. And for those in the room who are not familiar with the TEI customization mechanisms, the TEI offers a way to modify the schemas that you can validate your documents against. And you describe your customizations in a TEI document itself, which is then processed against the TEI source files, and you can do things like removing elements, adding new elements, modifying the attributes and other sort of characteristics of your schema. So we're thinking about creating a customization for these documents. And we were inspired by the recent discussions in the TEI community about representing manuscripts, about the genetic encoding work that's been done. So we started from thinking about, since we have these wonderful images of these very fragile documents, which apparently are very difficult to access in their physical manifestation, that we might focus our encoding on representing as carefully and as interestingly as we could these physical documents themselves, rather than trying to create a reading text or some conceptual version of the text that was more about, the literary and linguistic structures. We wanted to think about the physical structures, the documentary structures. But what happened as we started to work through the project is we sort of found ourselves working up from the diploma. We took a model very similar to the one that Gregor was showing yesterday, where you have surfaces and zones and lines. These are, again, sort of following from the TEI's current way of modeling this information. And we sort of put that customization in place and then began to work through our model. And it's at that point that, things begin to get interesting. You can put enough of a customization in place to get yourself up and working, to make sure that your encoders are perhaps all agreeing on the certain outlines of a problem. But then you sort of have to be focusing in more closely on what are the things that are actually of interest to you. And so when I talk about working up from the diploma, we started off, marking very carefully the lines and all the sort of interesting meta marks that you find on these pages, and finding this sort of very careful diplomatic transcription somewhat unsatisfying for the purposes that we were trying to work towards. Not to say that it's not a valid goal in and of itself, but we found that we weren't really after diplomatic transcriptions, partly because we'll have these wonderful images sitting right alongside them. And so that's a factor to consider, the ways that these different data representations sit next to each other and rub up against each other. And so what happened is that we eventually stopped marking certain of the meta marks, and I'll just give one example, which is around deletions, the ways that certain paragraphs or sections of the text are canceled out. We were encoding information that described exactly how those cancellations looked on the page, where the cross outlines went and exactly what kind of information was contained there. And it wasn't really answering the questions that the scholars who were working on the project were interested in. They were really interested in the dialogue that these physical documents represent between Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley during the composition of Frankenstein. And so we found it more useful to record, we were recording all along both the markings that indicated deletions and the deletions themselves. So you can represent that there's a meta mark indicating a cancellation, and you also have a separate set of tags for indicating that something has in fact been deleted. And those are two slightly different statements. And we found ourselves sort of dropping the statements about the meta marks and the careful description of these sort of drawings on the page. Whether that was a good decision or not, I guess we'll find out. But we found ourselves then not really being able to say that we were dealing with diplomatic transcriptions, but we were dealing with, again, a different selection of features that was hoping to indicate more clearly the sort of interplay of deletions and insertions, the moving around of the text as a conversation between these two writers. And that sort of leads us to ask, and I guess this is where I was having trouble with our conversation this morning, that we seemed to be circling around a definition of usefulness, where we were saying that putting less information into the documents made them more useful to more people. And I was having trouble with that definition of usefulness. That the less information we put in, the more people could use them for their other purposes. Whereas really, we were finding that the scholars in this project wanted to use markup, wanted to use data modeling, to engage in a conversation with other scholars in their field about the development of this text, and that therefore it was actually helpful to us to put more interpretive judgments into the text so that people could disagree with us, so that people could fight against our model, and that is a perfectly valid and scholarly reuse of our material, reuse of our markup. That I think the demands of interchange, or the sort of seeming size of the interchange problem, perhaps distracts us from a sort of humanistic approach to this endeavor of doing markup, where we're not really interested in providing the most minimal sort of interchangeable representations, but as Steve has said about text analysis, we're interested in provoking more arguments, making more interesting readings. And in some cases, that requires very carefully and perhaps elaborately encoding our interpretive judgments right into the supposedly clean data. And I wanted to sort of think about that from the perspective of information science. And this is from some work that people at the Center for Informatics Research and Science and Scholarship at the University of Illinois have been doing, where Alan works. This is a paper by Carol Palmer, who's the director of that center, and Nicholas Weber and Melissa Cragen, where they're talking about some studies that they did of reuse of scientific data in these new big digital repositories of data. And they're drawing on an information science researcher called Birger Hjorlund, who wrote about something called the epistemic potential of documents. And they're thinking about how to apply this to collections of data in order to assess whether we're doing a good job at digital preservation or data curation. And I think the interesting thing here is this idea of transfer of knowledge and where that happens, and where in the process of building up a model we begin to transfer knowledge, and how we think about the different ways of making that happen through the act of modeling. And I think this ties in very closely with the conversations that we've been having about validation. How do we know when it's good enough? And is that the same question as how do we know when it's valid? And that in turn is related to this larger question that I want to point out from both literary studies and scientific data of the point at which we begin to transfer knowledge. And there was in our discussion this morning, we got into, I thought, an interesting part of the conversation about the interaction between a data model and the activities that go on around the data model. And whether there's a point at distinguishing what of that is still data modeling and what of that is something else. And so in the process of writing a TEI customization, you can write your odd file, which is how you encode your customization, and it seems very clear that you're speaking about the data model. What kind of things exist in your documentary universe? But you're at the same time keeping track of how people will use the system that you are building. So it's less helpful to think about it as a document and more helpful to think about it as a program that has certain interfaces, that has certain behaviors, even at the level of writing your supposed data model. You're thinking about if your encoders are working in a program like Oxygen, which will read the schema and provide them certain help as they're trying to encode the document, what kind of information you can put in your model so as to prompt the program that your encoders are using to encode their instance documents to do certain things or not do certain other things. And this is, I think, distinct from the level of just what the schema tells them they can and can't put in, because there's a level at which you can specify that behavior on a sort of valid or invalid level, and then there's a level you're trying to govern at more of a behavioral level or a community level. And I think those interchanges are interesting. And the way in which the data model there is working at transferring knowledge in different ways to different audiences. And this goes to the question of sort of how we document our data models. And working with TEI customization projects, certainly working with the documents in the Shelley Godwin archive, the TEI has a wonderful mechanism not only of writing these customizations, but at the same time you're writing the customization, you can write the documentation right along with it. You can produce beautiful versions of it in multiple formats, and you can do all those wonderful XML things. But that doesn't seem like fully documenting the data model. You don't seem to have captured what you set out to do. So I would argue for a sort of richer sense of what it means to document a data model that encompasses things like the validation routines themselves. So not only the actual schema itself, the instantiation of your conceptual model, but the programs that run against that model, the programs that run against instance documents encoded against that model. In addition to the sort of prose and the shared behaviors, which you work out in encoding the documents that you're working with in your archive. And that really, to describe the data model, you need this broader set of documentation. You need to have the programs, and this, I think, sort of ties into the things that Carrie was talking about yesterday. When we talk about digital preservation, and we understand things like representation information, and we try to draw boundaries around what are all the things we need to make sure we've stored away somewhere in order to preserve this object through time. And so things that look like documents, like TEI documents, are of course sort of, in a sense, programs. That in itself is not surprising. But sort of putting this, going through the process of customization and understanding the ecosystem within which that customization works will allow us to give fuller descriptions to collaborators such as librarians and archivists of exactly what it is these objects of scholarship are, what it is that they need to model in their systems of archives and libraries and digital repositories. And I kind of want to leave my talk a little short because I'm very interested in people's responses to this. Thinking about the ways in which customization, the putting in of actually more information can spark, through both automated and human means, a sort of richer notion of data modeling, or a data modeling that participates in the humanities in a different way than we've been speaking of before, not simply the interchange of cultural heritage objects, but a real participation in the humanistic debate that we know from disciplines that are not explicitly digital. So I'm interested to hear and have further conversation around these topics. Thank you.
What a surprise.
Sorry. I like this idea of documenting the data model as well as documenting the encoding schema, the encoding practices. I've seen a beautiful realization of this idea of yours. In 2006 at Digital Humanities in Paris, there was Godwin that presented his documentation of data model using METS files, which we have also used at King's, a few project of ours. Basically what we do is that, okay, which XML goes against which XSLT to produce which HTML, use which JavaScript, which CSS. So the full processing, that was for preservation issues, of course. So not just in that sense, I don't know if it is exactly what you think, but you were thinking about the data model, but together with the full documentation of the encoding, which can be very beautifully described by ODD, as you said, not only the scheme, how you build it, but how you use it, and how you have encoded, which is the meaning of your encoding, and how to get from here to there. But there is also this aspect, how you tool the beautiful website and the stuff work, and why it works like that. Mm-hmm. So we experimented with METS, that's the idea.
Right, and that's a very interesting example, and I think it is perhaps even a better example than the ones that we've generated so far with Shelley Godwin, and I think it covers a lot of the things that I was trying to bring up, but also points to the absence that I'm still pointing at, which is that I've often found when doing a TEI customization, there's always a certain point at which you stop specifying at greater and greater detail, where you could logically go on. So, in other words, even the odd file, even the programs and the behaviors are perhaps not capturing all the modeling work that's going on, because part of it is social, that's not actually enforced by the tools, but is part of the sort of a reenactment of the project, and looking for other ways to grasp at that information.
On the other hand, the more you scare me.
I know.
The more we invest in the idea that our executables are an important part of our electoral contribution, the more committed we are to the incomprehensibility of our electoral contribution. We don't know how to talk about dynamic process. We don't know how. We don't know how to
I don't know if Wendell.
Fine is only if you want to carry on speaking, you come in the middle.
I don't know if Wendell wants to offer hope, but maybe if he does, then I'll go first because I don't have anything to offer. I wonder whether, I mean, yes, that seems to be true, and yet it seems important to point at the loss that, you know, is then incumbent upon us, that we maybe become, in all the dialogue around sort of interchange and, you know, independence from any particular platform, that we've become sort of too confident in that we are saving what we think we're saving. And that a sort of clearer acknowledgement of the loss of the things we don't yet know how to preserve is a sort of interesting thing to consider, and perhaps even to mark out in our models, you know, that which will be lost at certain, you know, strategies of preservation, you might say.
Wendell.
Yeah, I would accept that, and I also think, I mean, to me, you know, among the many wonderful things in what Trevor just presented to us is, for me personally, the reminder of what I was thinking about 10 years ago when I wrote that article that you cited at the beginning, which is that to talk about these things within the tradition of rhetorical theory and poetic theory, and to understand that when we create these things, we're actually engaged in a kind of rhetoric and a kind of performance, right? And that with respect to that, and with respect to the problems that Elena and Michael and you are pointing to with this notion of documenting the data model, I think the thing to keep in mind is that what we're presenting is actually something that is, it has many parts, but it also has a whole to it. And that in some respects, the risk of documenting the data model, not that that's a bad thing, but the risk is that we then move the gravity of our work away from the production itself into the documentation about the production, which is always a risk with humanities, I think, but it's something that's especially kind of ironic and interesting when we're doing such fabulous things with the text that we're working with and the encodings of those texts and the performances that we drive on top of those encodings, right? Which have a kind of, they also speak to what we're trying to say, which I think is one of the most important things that you were reminding us of, is that this is not something that, you know, we're trying to sort of have the last word, even though we always are, right? I mean, there's always this idea that I'm going to say the thing and then it'll have been said and everybody will then refer to me, right? But the reality is that they're going to talk back. And in fact, if, you know, I think that, you know, the interesting thing about the transition that we're seeing now in terms of the evolution of the humanities as a whole is that we're moving away from that notion that that any individual scholar is going to have the last final word, or that that's the proper aspiration of the scholar. And that instead, even though we're, in a sense, going to sort of privately entertain ourselves with that idea, we also don't take it fully seriously, and we understand that part of the purpose of our trying to have the last words so other people can speak back to that. And in that, I think that documenting the data model is all very good because it speaks to other specialists, but the data model itself encompasses the work, and the work is something to a broader audience potentially as well, not just to fellow scholars. So, you know, come back to that.
So, if you,
Yeah.
do you want to say something, or what?
No, Sid is frowning, so I want to get to that.
But I'm not frowning at you, Trevor.
Well, no, it's a thoughtful frown. That's all I was saying.
So I want to admit up front that I don't know how to model what I'm about to say, because it's indirect speech. Michael asserted that we have difficulty documenting processes, and I'm wondering why Michael says that. I don't want to say, what do you mean we, Kimasabi, because I might have trouble documenting processes, but Michael, I've read your documentation of processes, and it's pretty good.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I think Laurent said I had the yeah. The fan proving the equivalence of two sets of declarative statements, which is a difficult but soluble problem, and proving the equivalence of two Turing machines, which is a difficult and insoluble, in the general case, problem. It's not the documentation of processes is a bad thing. It's obviously a good thing, and it helps. I feel guilty because I'm horrified by the thought that we're going to say the way we process this is part of the meaning of our data, and yet whenever I look at strange data, I want to say, yeah, can you show me how you're using this? Because I don't understand what you're doing here. And once I see the website, it's, oh, okay, so yeah. Now that helps. So it's very helpful, but if you give me a Fortran executable or a COBOL executable, and this is not a fantastic thing. There were, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, there were a lot of people trying to make new versions of existing programs and prove that they would behave exactly the same way, except that they wouldn't die on January 1st, 2000.
Well,
and that's a hard problem because who knows why? It's part of a gap in our logic, a gap in our heads. It's talking about the way processes execute is hard.
Well, and there's also sort of two things going on there. I mean, there's the concern about being able to, assert an equivalence between two processes, which we say is hard and possibly not doable, which seems to be a concern about preservation or sort of that this thing hasn't been tampered with, it's still the same thing that someone put in. And then there's the way that this sort of bids participation in the humanities, which is we're not really interested in the equivalence of the one process to the other, but the response of one process to the other, the way that those performances respond to each other. And those are two sort of threads going on there.
I'm not sure how to frame this question. I want to get back to what Wendell was saying, because I think there's an interesting mapping onto what we think about as different kinds of scholarship or different layers of scholarship. And I was very struck by your invoking the sort of performative rhetorical aspects, because one of the things that struck me in our conversations yesterday was a kind of a Matthew Arnold style distinction possibly between the sort of the Hellenistic and the Hebraistic, or the thinking and doing in a kind of crude way. And I think I've always been aware of myself as being the kind of person who ought to be a scholar because I'm so bad at doing things in real time. Right? And so it's good that I get to write them down. And that's why events like this always make me very nervous because, here it is, it's all happening in real time. But I wonder whether when you say the data is the work and that the documenting the data is, in effect, some part of another discourse, a meta-discourse that is aimed at another audience, I wonder whether that sort of piques my interest, because there is this ongoing question of where the scholarship is in digital scholarship. And is it in the creation of the data? Is it in the annotation of the data? Is it in writing about the data? Is it in documenting the data? And I feel fond of the idea that in digital humanities, documenting the data is actually the distinctively scholarly aspect, or one distinctively scholarly marker. And not that doing the data isn't also scholarship, but I wouldn't want to sort of sequester off the documentation as somehow too expensive an indulgence or too, Hellenistic, whatever that means.
Absolutely, and I'm perfectly with you on that. But at the same time, the proof of the pudding is that it's delicious, right? And we're beginning to see that. I mean, we are beginning to see that in humanities stuff. These projects that are manifestly interesting to people who aren't deep, don't have their heads in the encoding.
The hack speaks louder than the yak.
Well, and I think that part of the reason that's happening is that, for but nevertheless, it is delicious. To the extent that there's an emphasis within the digital humanities on documenting processes and figuring out how we're going about doing this, and developing standards to allow others to replicate and to build on this information. That's all really very, very important, because that's how we're going to have this work be sustainable. And yet, on the other hand, there has been a way in which I think, because we have been so long in delivering results that speak for themselves, there's been this counter emphasis within the community on doing this as if it's going to, we're eating biscuits because we're hungry.
Right, but if we talk
While
about
putting
them
still
really
in the
well,
oven,
then yeah.
that's not a bad thing. And on the contrary, I think that that all of that work which we do with each other is profoundly important, because we're going to learn how to do our own work better. And yet at the same time, you can't forget that there is something that we're trying to communicate.
Well, and not to get too lost in the metaphors, but also to veer away from the food. I mean, when you're giving your Lego analogy, I don't know if anyone else had this problem, but in my Lego sets, there were always ones that got stuck together and they were kind of clumpy and you could never really get them apart again. And yet those became interesting pieces for future constructions. And, I guess I'm arguing a little bit for the sticky Legos, but.
Stephen.
I'm still sort of stuck on this notion.
Come here, over here, Steve.
You seem to have much better ears than we.
I'm still stuck on this moment in this presentation where you said, they're kind of groping for what they're doing. Why are we doing this? And they finally decided that what they're doing is they're trying to enable a conversation with other scholars about their choices. That's a paraphrase of what I heard. Is that accurate? Some sentence like that here in the paper.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, so they want to, and I assume choices here mean that things like this scribble over here is Percy Shelley and not Mary Shelley. Or this cross out must refer to this regard.
Well, yeah, the more interesting examples are, this was written first and then crossed out, and you get, so it's a bit more about stages is the interesting thing, but.
And as they're going along, they're paring down, it's like, only certain things are relevant, and only certain things in the odd file or in TPI are relevant to this. You should mark some of this in the odd files.
Right, but I mean, I guess I don't think I'm agreeing in the sort of universalizing sense that I think you're headed toward, but.
Well, where I'm headed is it seems to me that we would have, maybe, we would at some point have to say why data modeling is the best access to that, is the best way to enable that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because in this case, we're not talking about enabling future processing with tables. We're talking about, they've decided what they're doing, what it's about. And you really, someone has to convince me that really odd customization is the way to enable that conversation, as opposed to saying, there are these 6 cruxes in this text where it's really strange, really interesting from the liberator's point of view. We're going to list them and talk about them, and we invite you to talk back. That's a very, is that really vastly inferior, totally flawed, as opposed to saying, no, we're going to ensconce this in a TPI.
Yeah.
That's an amazing thing.
Well, I don't think I was trying to make that argument that the TI encoding model is a better way to do it than the way.
But this is sort of what we're talking about in
Right.
this symposium, right? I mean, we want to make a claim that for certain kinds of intellectual affordances,
Yes.
for data modeling.
Yes.
And this is actually, here's a case where I don't see it, actually. I really don't.
Well, I think we'd have to get.
I don't see it over other kinds.
Yes. Well, and I would say at the moment it's an open question, and we have to get a little further along in the project before we could really argue back and convince you. I have some confidence. Well, no, but I mean, I guess I want to argue that whether or not it's a better way or a less good way, there is an interesting way in which data modeling is another way of approaching this text and sort of communicating our choices about it that opens up further scholarship in a different and perhaps useful and interesting way than our sort of just writing about it. And in other words, in this deletion business.
I'm not hearing it. How?
Well, partly because you're sort of enforcing the enforcement of the system and the way that that interplays with. Sorry.
Oh, and because it puts that set of
Many
data.
people.
Yeah.
Can I have an answer on Trevor's behalf? It's not necessarily better to have an encoded text that an article that says these 6 cruxes are really interesting. But you know, I've read an awful lot of articles that say, well, you have to pay attention to the cruxes. But I am not going to commit myself by saying what I think those are. You know, whereas in encoded text, if you have a crux element, you got to make a choice. You got to say, this I call a crux, and this I don't. And
That's not an inability in the art.
no, true. It's an inability on the other side. It's some formalisms make it harder for us to walk. And one advantage of those formalisms is that we can use them to keep ourselves accountable. Now, whether that's exactly what Trevor had in mind, I don't know, but
That's along the lines that we're going, but I mean, I think we can acknowledge Steve's point that yes, we have to prove it.
I would like to try taking a slightly different tack. I find it fascinating to acknowledge that the inclusion of the performative aspect of what we do when we deal with data should actually be reflected in data models. But then, of course, there comes this question of cost-benefit analysis. How much effort do you want to put into documenting the process and reflecting the process versus dealing with the primary source object that actually initiated the entire chain of processes or the network of processes that you get involved in? And I think we're obviously not the first to encounter that problem. Just look at the history of literary studies over the past 50 years, where we progressed from a positivist to a structuralist, to a post-structuralist, and eventually to a deconstructionist paradigm. Now, once I'm in the deconstructionist DH paradigm, I don't give a damn about the original source objects any longer. I'm so obsessed with myself. What I'm doing, how great it is, and so forth. And hey, that might be what really does the trick for me. Whereas somebody else who is rightly or wrongly labeled as an absolute conservative and traditionalist will say, listen, this is not for me. I'm actually dealing with a text or a monument or what have you. I think it's a question of philosophical premise that we touch upon here, and we have to make a decision, each and every one of us, how far along the line we want to go. The second question, of course, is, and that's perhaps the more pragmatic one, that we should start investigating some criteria for making this cost-benefit analysis. I mean, for example, what you just said, Michael, if it helps to stop the waffling, I, for one, am all for it. Right? But that's just me. Somebody else might say, hey, I know it all. So I think perhaps we have to shift the focus of attention away from just dealing in assumptions and likes and dislikes, and more towards establishing criteria that will enable us to determine how far along this route we want to go, and where we say it's now becoming non-productive. We're actually circling around ourselves, and there's no progress.
Where's my kid?
Just wanted to point out, maybe we are not really talking about data modeling at all here, because I think if you have a very traditional edition, printed edition, you said, I'm not so much interested in what's really on the page, but what's happening behind that. And many people say, yeah, but that's not really an edition. So maybe we are talking about different sets of standards, and they are not really relating to the question of data modeling, but what do you want to achieve with what you're doing? Is it a comment on something, or is it an edition which provides other to comment on the text? And I think, in a way, you started out with this edition, what you described, and then on the way you changed, did you go?
Can it be both though?
Actually, I think then you're mixing up things which you shouldn't do, because it's much easier to point if you say, this is the addition part, and this is my comment part. And then you would say, okay, your comments I totally disagree with, but thanks for the addition. Julia.
I think also there's a question of scale at stake here. I mean, Trevor's example shows a single manuscript with 6 cruxes in it, perhaps, or whatever the number is, but it's a small number. But I think if you had been proposing to us, for example, the Faust edition with, you know, God help us, probably hundreds of thousands of revision sites and so forth, the question of what kinds of things get revised here becomes a kind of question that you really need the markup for, right? And you also potentially need to be able to debate about the markup for. And I think that that sort of much larger case might be an interesting use case to sort of address the question that Steve is raising. I mean, certainly when someone comes to me as a TEI person and says, you know, I want to encode this poem so that I can study this poem. I'm like, well, why don't you just study the poem? You don't need TEI for that, right? But if they come to me with 100,000 poems,
Right.
then it seems like there's another kind of problem.
Right.
Yeah.
But then we moved into, like, then we are explicitly imagining processing the data. This is where it's shaping out the data. Like, right at that moment, we now move over from, well, we're interested in weapons, over to, no, we need a machine to deal with that, to just show us basic, you know, so we can process kind of line. But when I kiss, Trevor waving his hand, we're all waving our hands on this one, right? I mean, this is me, including me. I mean, it feels like a complete question mark in the conversation. But I don't think in this context we want to treat data modeling and its intellectual affordances and scholarly worth and all of that as a kind of, you know, assumption. And actually, it's why the talk is so interesting, because it feels like kind of, you know, breaks out this uncomfortable moment in our.
Susan? I'm just getting things. Eleanor was there. Then Jack, and then
Data model is a very generic word in that sense, and which goes to the question which actually we put in online, which is the edition. And if it is actually just the XML that we have to document, or everything else we have to document, which was a little bit what I was at the beginning saying. I've been saying quite a lot lately that in my opinion the edition is not the XML. It's not the HTML, it's not the CSS, it's not the XSLTs all together. Because you cannot take one or the other without looking at the other, because XML will not convey the way to use the thing. It's very complex, and say that you can separate things is very difficult as well. So you cannot say, I just take this page, that is where the scholarship says, and the final website is not the scholarship, or only the scholarship is one of that. They are very complex objects that we need to take into consideration. And even our comment and understanding of it, you need to be part of it. So I'm not sure you can separate, as you were saying, the level of the edition and the level that the editor thinking about the edition and the doing of the edition. If you want to go back to the print world, there was always a part of the editor presenting his idea of editing, the consideration of the text, the presentation of the evidence. It's just that the print world has given a standardized way for presenting this model, the data model, and the evidences. Otherwise, we are inventing a new one because our tools are different.
Yeah. Well, and I think
we're talking about different things here. We're talking about the interpretation and the edition, and which is another thing than to say we have different aspects of the edition. But
no,
that's what was my point.
Well, I was just sort of agreeing with that point and sort of resisting this introduction of the edition as a category because I don't know that it was helping. But I think there's a connection between some of the comments that Steve was making and your comment about having sort of measures of quality or measures at which we sort of consider there's a sort of no further dividend to be gained. And sort of Laura's comment that we're sort of modeling in the hope that some visualization or analysis will appear that will have made our modeling worthwhile. And I think rather than sort of continuing to model forward and hoping that appears, to think hard about the interaction between our modeling and these kind of points or standards, reformulated in this new digital space for, what is good enough or where is there a sort of loss of traction.
And I know I'm interrupting, but I think squaring this particular circle here, I don't think Fotis is right, but I don't think you're wrong either. I think what you're describing is a particular approach to the discipline of editing. And there are many possible disciplines of editing which can be defended on their own terms, which may differ with that particular approach, but which on their own terms are perfectly legitimate and may also have a disciplinary basis. And so, it's like, I don't think that we're really disagreeing on any fundamental level, Elena and you and I and Trevor, with respect to, differentiating between the presentation, the editing, the commentaries and so forth and so on. But I do think that particular kind of distinction is something that is realized in the instance, rather than being something that we can prescribe for all time, all editing up front.
Yeah. Lunch. We are doing this at lunch.
Following up on that, I raised my hand because I wanted to agree and disagree with Fotis. I did sense in your presentation, Trevor, that you shifted from having your digital humanities hat on to having your library archives hat on in the middle and talked about preserving all this context. But I heard your earlier point, underscored by Wendell later, as being that even if we don't preserve it, we should understand it as a rhetorical act and as in the context of lots of stuff that is not necessarily captured there, but it's enabled by it. And I think you could trace this back to book history and say, okay, your commentary it may be different from the edition proper, if you want to see it that way, but it assumes a publishing context and it assumes the cost of publishing and the availability of audiences and printing media and that sort of thing. And it's all of those constraints that shape the rhetorical act of expression.
I'm refraining myself.
So building on the idea of markup as a rhetorical act, I kept actually thinking of speech act theory when you were making that argument. So it's sort of illocutionary act. J.L. Austin's doing things as words. An illocutionary act is when you say something, you do something. So if we just simply list, what the debates are, or it feels a little bit more non-committal. It feels like you're putting a stake in the ground once you've actually had to represent it. So it's representational versus something else like exegetical. And so it just feels like you're raising the stakes by actually, representing the composition history in some way in your markup. So I don't know. The example, I know you were not thrilled with the example of an edition, but I think of like A.E. Hausman editing someone like Ovid, where he makes a conjecture and he inserts his conjecture directly in the text instead of confining it to the apparatus of the text. And there's something, kind of dangerous about it that I think I find appealing. So.
Yes, ma'am.
This point that has been made, when you started, you said we worked up from the manuscript as the first step of looking at the zones
Well, I don't know that a strong either-or answer there satisfies me very well. I mean, I think as Doug was pointing out, I have a hard time keeping one hat on versus the other. I mean, the DH person versus the librarian. And I think, in Carol's elaboration of this idea in the paper, I think there's a sort of much more well-developed argument about user communities and thinking about user needs and how that interacts with the ways that scientists in this case are using the data as they generate it and using it for their own purposes, and the way that interacts with the reuse or use by others later. But I think this is an area that there's probably a fuzzy part in the middle between those two approaches that needs reinventing or re-examining or further work on it at the very least.
What a discussion. Thank you all. We have lunch break.